You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 110. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Sarah, I've been thinking about, my family's going through selling a house right now. It's the house that my wife and her sister grew up in, and once their parents died, they needed to sell the house. Neither one of them have lived in the house for years, but we've come to the place of selling it, and there are lots of things, feelings, thoughts that come to mind when they walk through and there's no more furniture that's there. And there are words like, I can't believe we got all the furniture in this room, and it feels strange to be in it now without the furniture. Or you walk into a place and say, we always called this the new room. It was built in 1968, but it was always the new room. There are feelings and emotions, there are thoughts that you can go into every room and there's a memory that's there. And so what I get the feel of, because, I've only been a part of the family for 40 some years and they grew up there, that in every room, there's almost a feeling of loss. Or you go into every room and there's a feeling of, I remember when this happened or this was said, and there's kind of a longing for that day again. So, that's what I'm thinking of as we start this podcast today.
And what I'm thinking about is remembering my grandmother's funeral. She lived to be 99 and a half years old. And in one of those passing moments at the visitation, I heard my dad utter these words, and I wish I could remember who he said them to. He didn't say them to me directly. I overheard him say, "I'm an orphan." And it kind of struck me as odd, and at the same time, it broke my heart, because here's my dad in his late 50s, early 60s. I'd have to do the math. And the longing that I heard in his voice was one of place, of connection, of family, of belonging. He was questioning, where do I belong? That's a human longing. So before we tell you what the question is for this week, Tim, you want to remind our listeners what we're doing throughout this series of Lent?
Throughout Lent, we're exploring a series of 5 questions designed to enhance whatever you've already planned for this Lenten season. We're calling this series Step into the Arena. Every week, we'll explore one question with stories and illustrations that leave you with a challenge that you can practice in the midst of your everyday, ordinary life. Now, to accompany this podcast series, join us inside the private Facebook group for the Hope of Lament, because each week we'll reflect on one psalm using the question we offer on the podcast. You can find a link to the Facebook group in the show notes at transformingmission.org/110. That's 110. 110. So last week we introduced our first question: who are the people entrusted to your care? You'll find more on that episode, in that discussion, in episode 109. This week, you have any guesses about what the question is based upon how we began this podcast?
So if the question last week was, who are the people entrusted to your care? And Tim, you talked about selling a childhood home. I talked about death. There was death in both of those, but that's not the point. So I'm wondering if the question is, what keeps the people entrusted to your care up at night?
I'd like to say, oh, that's cool, but I'm not sure that that's how I feel, but I do like it. I think that's close. So can I say, let's talk about that for a minute?
Sure.
So what keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night? Knowing that my nieces have a house full of 6 babies. Yes, 2 of them have, their babies are sick. What keeps me up at night? Recognizing that my to-do list for tomorrow is longer than there are hours in the day. What keeps me up at night? The compassion that I have for others. When I see people who are hurting, I hurt. And if I'm honest, it's a place that I know that I can get emotionally hooked, and I replay the story over and over and over in my brain, and that can keep me up until I unhook myself from that. The other thing, and this is not at all what you're asking, but what keeps me up at night is when I have been seated too much throughout the day and I haven't moved enough, so I'm not physically tired. That keeps me up at night. How about you, Tim? What keeps you up at night?
I think what keeps me up at night is I'm just old and I just don't sleep well. But that doesn't answer our question.
That's not the question, folks.
In some of the churches with the people with whom I deal, I feel like that if we could just love one another a little more, life would be a whole lot different for individuals and for the church. And what keeps me up at night is, how can I convince people just to care for one another? It's not necessarily that you call everybody out on everything. And what keeps me up at night is, how do I come alongside of people who want to call people out, and at the same time, I'm trying to help them care and come alongside. That's one of the things that keeps me up. Another thing that keeps me up is that I got 3 granddaughters, and I see them as often, I think, as I want to, although we don't live in the same town. But they're growing up pretty fast. And one of the things that I think about a lot is what I'm missing. I say that because God has used my children and my grandchildren to help make me more who I am, who I'm supposed to be. And I really like that piece of the shaping that God does for me. So it keeps me up. I'm saying, I wish I could be more a part of who they are, because they've been so much a part of who I am. I mean, I could keep going, but those are a couple of things. They're all with relationship. I'll say this, and I shouldn't say it because it becomes a soundbite, but I'll say it anyway. If it weren't for people, I could sleep pretty well.
So let me ask you who are listening to this podcast, what keeps the people entrusted to your care up at night? And if I had to guess, I would say it's family. Tim and I both mentioned that. Health or disease, what's happening in the midst of that with the people that you love and care for. Work and money. Those are the big things that grab people. So, Tim, do you want to share with our listeners, what is the question for this week?
How do the people entrusted to your care experience the longings and losses that make up the human condition?
You want to say that again? Because that's a big question.
How do the people entrusted to your care experience the longings and losses that make up the human condition?
So you're going to hear some themes echo from episode 109 in this episode as well. And there's a reason for that. There's a thread that runs through all of these questions. So think for a minute about someone in your life who is juggling multiple demands of life, whether it's family, work, church, social life, recreational life, kids, their school, church activities, health, being present. Can you show up at the wrestling match and be present? Well, there's a major project that's closing at work. Will your doctors ever find the true source of your mother's illness? Will your husband find a job after being laid off? There are changes happening in the life of our church. We want to do it right, but what does right mean? And what's the preparation and education that is needed when now all of a sudden we're living in times that seem more like pre-Christian times than Christian times. All of those things are happening all around us. And I have gathered that laundry list of life stuff just from interactions that I've had with people over the past week. And what I want you to hear in that is, as leaders, the question that we're asking you to consider, and we said this last week as well, it's not just a doing thing, it's a caring thing. It's about the emotion to care. So as we thought about those of you that listen to this podcast, part of what I've recognized is that for folks who want to follow Jesus every day where they live, work, and play, they're overwhelmed and they're busy and they're stressed. They don't want to live that way, but that's the reality of what's happening in the midst of their life.
So, Sarah, could we say that one of the reasons we may, I'm going to use the word default, that we default to tasks as opposed to being stewards and caring is because it helps us manage all of this stress? Would that be one way to think about it?
Yeah, I think so. And how I would name all of this is we have to reckon with what we are feeling. And for most of us, even as adults, we haven't been taught to pay attention to how we're feeling and what's happening in our bodies. And so when we're overwhelmed and stressed, those are emotions that hook us. And so knowing when we get emotionally hooked and then getting curious about what's that all about? Why am I overwhelmed? Have I put too many things on my calendar? Have I said yes to too many things? What often happens is we point the finger at somebody else. Well, they need me to do this and they need me to do that. There are ways that you can choose to respond or not respond to. I'm thinking about when I was a youth pastor. Your kids don't have to participate in 5 extracurricular activities. You can set boundaries. And so if you're overwhelmed driving your kids to all of those activities and doing everything that accompanies that, think about what led to that. Now, I'm not offering parenting advice here. What I'm trying to get at is there is a choice that you can make, but you have to get curious about the emotions and where that emotion is coming from. So when we're hooked, there are 2 responses. You either get curious about the emotion that you're feeling, or you offload that emotion. Now, Tim, which do you think usually happens?
I'm going to hand it off to someone else.
Yep, you offload those emotions on someone else. So this week, we're going to talk about getting curious about our emotions. And then next week, we're going to talk about offloading our emotions and how we can recognize when we're doing that so that we can stop doing it. So said a little bit differently, we'll model the healthy response this week. And then next week, we'll explore the lies that we tell ourselves. And again, I want you to hear me loud and clear. Most of us haven't learned to get curious when we're emotionally hooked. That's a fact. It's not a judgment. So as we move into the application for this week, you're going to notice some similarities to last week, but you will also notice that we're focusing on emotions. So to help you reflect and act on your response to the question, how do the people who are entrusted to your care experience the longings and losses that make up the human condition? We're going to walk through a series of questions. And once again, we invite you to hit the pause button after we ask each one of these questions. So, Tim, you want to walk through the first question?
Sure. I want you to think about last week. What are the stories you've heard from the people entrusted to your care? I guess what I'm asking is over the past week, what are the stories you've heard from people who are entrusted to your care? What's happening with family? What's happening with friends? What's happening in the church, with the church? What's happening at work? Bring to mind those stories. Remember the stories. And then ask yourself this question. Were they stories of celebration, heartache, disappointment? What stage of life are the people in? Young children, newly married, empty nesters, old people like me, midlife? One of the things we've talked about a lot in our podcast is being in the moment. And this is really what we're asking you to do, is to think back to the people who are entrusted to your care and what's happening in their lives.
And with those stories in mind, now I want you to consider these questions. What are you thinking about the stories of longing and loss that the people that are entrusted to your care shared with you? Once again, just name one thought, one sentence. If you're in a place that you can write it down, go ahead and do so. What are you thinking about the stories of longing and loss that the people entrusted to your care shared with you?
So the pattern we're using is that you've got the thoughts. Now, what are the feelings? What are you feeling about the stories of longing and loss of the people entrusted to your care and experience? Sarah says it this way: what are the vibrations in your soul? What's the one word that might describe that? Positively or negatively, but what would that word be?
What's that one emotion? No laundry lists here. We're keeping this simple. And then finally, what action is God inviting you to take to be present to the people entrusted to your care in the midst of their longings and losses? I'll just make a footnote here on that one. You might want to refer back to episode 107 and 109 if you haven't listened to those, because we talk about this question in a little bit more depth. So now I want to invite you to think about your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions, and the effect that what you've written down, so that thought, that one sentence, that one word for that emotion, and the actions that you're going to take, are they having the effect you and God desire? And if not, it's time to reckon with what's going on. And for our listeners, there's a 99.999% chance that you're going to need to reckon with the emotion if you're a human and if you have feelings. So don't skip by this too quickly, because none of us want to do it, but it's the very thing that we need to do. And so if I could say it this way, this whole episode is really about reckoning. Emotion drives our longings and losses. Our emotions drive us in the midst of longing and losses. Our thinking impacts our emotions. So if you skipped quickly over the question of emotion, I want you to go back and sit with it for a minute and ask yourself, what's the emotion that's driving you as you lead and listen to the people entrusted to your care, specifically through their longings and losses? You might want to consider where the people that are entrusted to your care were emotionally hooked. Did they say things like, "I'm so mad," or "it just breaks my heart," or "I wish I could take away their hurt"? Those are examples of being emotionally hooked. Again, I'm naming a fact. I'm not judging anyone here. Most of us don't want to get curious about the feelings and emotions with others, because if we start asking those questions, what begins to happen? We hear the truth. And to make it even harder, when it comes to our longings and losses, there are often difficult emotions in the midst of that. So we get hooked by the emotion, but don't know what's happening. You want to jump in here with anything?
So here's what I'm thinking. I remember a time being the pastor of a church, and it was a difficult time. It was difficult for the church, but it was also difficult for me as the leader. This comes to mind when you've used the words that show we're emotionally hooked. You know, I had people that were saying that they were angry. This is the same time where there were people that said I was focused to a fault, which meant that people weren't getting their way. I was doing the best I could to care for people. One of the things that happened in my life at that moment that brought about a transformation that's helped me become curious was that I was at one of those places in my life of just saying, you know, God can't even love these people. I don't know if any other pastor's ever been there, but that's kind of what I was feeling. And so it was kind of like I wasn't dealing with my feelings or my emotions. What I was doing was blaming them, because if they just acted differently, thought differently, felt differently, we'd be a whole lot better off. What happened in the midst of that, nothing in the terms of the church, but in terms of me, was my first granddaughter was born, Alexis. I've gone through all these years where people would shake my hand at the door and then show me a picture of a baby, and they'd say, "Isn't that a beautiful baby?" And I said, "Well, it's certainly a baby." Because the grandparents just go nuts. And I did the best I could, because that's it. But when my granddaughter was born, and the first time I saw her or held her, I experienced something that I'd never experienced before. Now, the reason I'm saying I got curious, because what I began to ask myself was, why? Why am I feeling this way? And then all this other stuff comes rushing back. Like, I wasn't very nice to so-and-so when they were telling me about their grandchildren. It was things like that. But what really came out of this, the whole point of the story, is that I began to ask God to have me love the people He'd given me to care, for whom I was to care, the way I was experiencing love with Alexis. That's the reason I can say that my granddaughters have had a tremendous shaping in my life. I hope that God can use me to shape their lives as much as God's used them to shape mine. But it's out of that experience I learned to be curious. You can tell maybe in my voice, I'm hooked. the emotion has me hooked with that, but it was a transformational piece for me. It's not just sentimental because she's my granddaughter. It became part of my life. It's a daily prayer. Help me love the people you've given me to love and serve.
So, Tim, what your story just illustrated is that journey that we can go on as followers of Jesus and as leaders who follow Jesus, to be more emotionally intelligent, to ask the questions and to get curious and to lead in a way that helps others to reckon with the emotions that they're feeling. And what I love about your story is you examined and got curious about your own feelings. So this isn't about naming the feelings of others. It's about what's going on in your own heart and soul, and what are you experiencing. And my hope and prayer for anyone who's listening is that the hard emotions happen less in your life than the good emotions, but sometimes we're in seasons of life that is not the case. And part of what I have experienced and why we stepped into this series for Lent is that in the midst of the hard and difficult things, I don't like what I'm about to say, but the church is often the last place that those conversations end up happening. And my hope and my desire is that the people that we are in relationship with as people of faith, the body of Christ, the church, become the first place that we have these conversations. And so I want to invite us to look at the psalm that we used for last week as an example, because I think it names the emotions that we don't want to utter, especially in the church. We introduced the idea of a lament. So last week we looked at Psalm 13 in the Facebook group, and we're going to read it and name the emotion in each verse. So Tim, why don't you read it and then I'll name what I'm hearing there. Does that work?
That works. We're starting at the first verse of Psalm 13, and that first verse is, "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?"
So I'm feeling alone, forgotten, perhaps invisible.
"How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart. How long will my enemy triumph over me?
So the psalmist named one of the feelings in the first part of that verse, sorrow. And then the second part, I'm feeling defeated.
Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death.
So again, there's a feeling of being forgotten or alone, being depleted. How I describe this, and forgive me because it's a Harry Potter reference, is the Dementors have struck. There's nothing left. They've sucked the life out.
And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall.
Again, a feeling of being defeated and ashamed.
But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation.
Feelings of trust and love.
I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me.
There's a feeling of assurance and gratitude. We didn't rehearse that in walking through it, so just let me say this. In hearing Tim read that and then naming those emotions, the difference between literally what I was feeling as you read that psalm with the first part, I could call to mind people that I know who are in those places. And yet when we got to that last part of, but still, I trust in your unfailing love. And it's, yes, okay, that's where I need to focus. All of this other stuff is not where I need to be focused. And so that's part of why I think the Psalms of Lament are such great psalms to reckon with our emotion, to be able to name it, because they name the things that we don't want to name.
I think that's what the lament is. It starts out with all the pain and the separation, the sorrow, the depletedness, and it ends with celebration, loving assurance, and gratitude. That's what's so powerful about the lament.
Yeah. So I'm guessing I'm just going to say it this way. There's likely one of you who's listening to this who's overwhelmed, who's stressed, and you're thinking, you know what? It's easier for me to stay in that alone and forgotten place, that depleted place. It's easier to ask, why me? It's harder to say, I've wrestled with my thinking long enough, God. I need to hear from you. It's harder to say, I feel like my enemies are overcoming me. And finally, it's harder to arrive at that place and to be reminded that God loves you and the assurance of that love. It might be harder, but where do you really want to be? And that journey doesn't happen. We may have read it in a minute, but that transformation doesn't often happen in a minute's time. So give yourself the time and space to experience that and to get curious. Tim can reflect back on his experience of his granddaughter. And yes, there was a moment that you pivoted, but my guess is in that moment of reckoning and recognizing, you began to start to respond differently, to think differently, to behave differently to the people around you. But there were probably times that you didn't get it right, and you had to be reminded of that baby that you held, that in a very real way, God was saying to you, just love my people.
You named it. And that's the way it's been with my life. Well, it's the way it's been all of my life. And Sarah, that's the reason I come to the place of saying that I need people, because God helps me become who I'm supposed to be in and through the people around me. And you've helped me put language like this that there are times I have to ask, I get curious, and I have to ask, why am I feeling the way I feel? Whether it's even anger, there are times when I feel angry, and it's usually, and I'm not saying this for anybody else other than myself, but it's usually something that I've not cared for within me that this person is bringing out in me.
Can you
and
say
I have
that
to
again?
ask myself why.
Can you say that again?
It's usually something in me that the interaction with somebody brings out. And that's the reason I say that God's using the people around me to become more who I'm supposed to be. If I limit myself only to the people who think and feel and act the way I do, I don't have the opportunity to be a whole person. And really, I think that's what we're talking about, even in this podcast.
So if I were to ask the question of you, how do we become more emotionally intelligent? I'd summarize it with these 3 simple statements. Tim's illustrated it with a story. Notice what you're feeling. Get curious about where the feelings are coming from. And then help the people around you that are entrusted to your care to do the same. Because experience tells me that many of us have a hard time naming the emotions that we're feeling. We're out of touch, if I can say it that way, with our feelings. And instead of slowing down and taking a deep breath and getting curious, we bust out the armor faster than a transformer might on a movie or our television. And the end result of that is you self-protect or you take out what you're feeling on the people that you love most. So what I want you to hear me saying is listen to your body. Is your heart racing? Is your head pounding? Are your eyes getting fierce and focused? Is your stomach turning and not in a way that's saying, I'm hungry, feed me? Are you feeling nauseous about what's happening? Did your legs go limp? Is your mouth getting dry? Or your palms sweaty? All of those physiological responses, it's why we call them feelings. Something's happening inside of us. And what many of us have been taught to do is, just pop the pill and then I won't have to feel that. And we never make it through the process of reckoning because instead of feeling our emotions and getting curious, we offload them on others. And we'll talk more about that in our challenge and application during episode 111. For now, I want you to get curious about how the longings and losses of the people entrusted to your care make you feel.
So let's ask the question one more time. What are you feeling about the stories of longings and losses the people entrusted to your care experience? What are those vibrations in your soul? What's that one emotion that you can name? And good or bad, it's not a value. Negative, positive, it's not a value. It's just who you are, and being able to name it and ask why allows you to become more who God created you to be.
So here's your challenge for this week. Practice answering the question, what are the longings and losses of the people who are entrusted to my care? And what are you feeling? Answer it before you step into a meeting, before you start a Bible study, before you return a phone call, before you pull out the ingredients to make dinner tonight. Because when you do, you'll step into the arena aware of who God has entrusted to your care, their humanity, and what the effect of your work will have on the people entrusted to your care. So go lead a movement of Jesus followers. You can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/110. Bye for now.